So we're going to want to add those things, and then we can at least begin the work of creating a second activity that will actually display the data from Firestore. So we can now save. I'm going to go back into my handler. So first I want an else statement here. If I click save, but I leave things blank, nothing happens, but there's no prompt to the user telling them to enter a restaurant name and choose a rating. So first of all, here, I'll put in an else statement here. We'll use the toast class. We'll maybe just put in a message of incomplete. So I'll try this out. I'll reload my activity. I'll test, I'll leave it blank and make sure that nothing gets saved so long as my name is missing or my spinner is set to 0 where it says select a rating. So I'll just apply those changes and restart the app. And I'll try to save an empty document to the database. Our validation check on line 17, it should run, and we should get a toast message. So if I take these things out, I try to save, I get a toast that says incomplete. If I add a name, but no rating, it says incomplete. If I add a rating, but no name, it still tells me incomplete. And now if I fill out both a name and choose a rating, it should save to Firestore. If I go and check, I've now got 3 documents. We also should add the code that if we save successfully, we want to clear out the form inputs, set our edit text back to blank, set our spinner back to the default option of select a rating, and we want to show a toast message. So in this case, we'll show confirmation and clear the inputs. So in this case, we'll set the text to an empty string. Oh, very well use set text instead. We'll set our spinner, we call the set selection method, and we'll set it back to the first item in our spinner, which says select rating. And lastly, we'll just set a confirmation toast. We'll say restaurant added. I'll put this code in the chat as well. So we want to do these 3 things. What we could do, good question, about how do we know this worked. What we could do is we could check for a null. So we could either use a try catch, or we could also check that the ID is not null. If the ID is null, we could throw an error. Probably the best way to do this would be with a try catch. Set doesn't return a Boolean. It's void. It doesn't actually return anything, as you can see. So I'll add one more. I'll apply these changes. And after we add this time, we should see our toast message confirmation. And our edit text and our spinner should get cleared out. So let's add one more. So I'll add one more restaurant. And now when I click save, we get a toast message and our form gets cleared out. Go back to Firebase. I've now got a new document. So adding this is largely working. Jay's is fantastic. Long lines at lunch. I don't know if they're open in the evening, but they have great burritos, great tacos. Highly recommend the fish tacos and the, I think they have a purple potato or a squash taco that are really good. Don't know, you'd have to check their website. I've only tried the tacos and the burritos there. So there's our add form. Yeah, I think they probably do. So now what we want to do, we're probably going to have to continue it next week. But I want to make a list activity that is going to query Firebase and use a recycler view and an adapter to display the data. So setting this up is going to be a bit involved. And then we also want to add, I want to add a floating action button here that will navigate to our list. And on our list, we'll want a floating action button that will navigate to this page. So let's go ahead and start setting things up so that we can actually display the data. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add a new activity to the app. So I'm going to click on File, New, choose Activity, and we're going to make a new empty activity. So I'll just leave my screen up for a minute. You can see the menu tree, File, New, Activity, Empty Activity. I'm going to call this list activity. And I will leave the rest of the options here. If you want to give it a different name, you can, but I'll call mine list activity. So in here, we're going to use a recycler view to display the query results. So I'll add this activity. And this is just going to give us another empty activity. Now, in order to use the recycler view, we're going to have to add a couple of dependencies into our build.gradle file. Not the project level one, but this one, the module.app one. So we're going to need a couple dependencies so that we can use the recycler view. I'm going to put them in the chat. We need a reference to the recycler view package. We also need a reference to the Firebase UI package because there's some classes in there we're going to need. Yeah, I guess using Pastebin, I don't use it much. It's a good suggestion. I'll maybe start to use that during class. So for the moment, I just put it in the chat. So these two lines, I'm going to put them into my build.gradle in the dependencies list. Doesn't really matter where they go. I'll put them underneath the other Firebase dependencies. So I'm going to paste those in. And Android Studio will say we need to sync the project. So I get this yellow info bar at the top. Gradle files have changed since last project sync. A project sync may be necessary for the IDE to work properly. So I'm going to click Sync Now. So we can use the Recycler view and we can use that Firebase UI library. So my sync only took a few seconds to complete. And then we'll open up our activity list.xml. So we've just got this empty activity. We're basically going to put two things on here. We're going to put a heading and then we're going to put our RecyclerView container. And then we need to create a separate XML layout. It's not a full activity, it's just a layout file that will serve as the template for that recycler. So again, I'll give you the XML layout that we need in our code window. So we've got a text view and a recycler view. So I'm going to put them inside my constraint layout here. And there's a couple of resources, a string resource and a dimension resource. Whoops, I am missing a closing slash here. So at the end of the recycler view, I need to close that slash. And then I want to create these two resources. Yeah, I'm feeling my way through it, so I'll maybe try to find something more efficient than using the chat. Actually, now that I think about it, we've already got a heading, so I'll just change that. Rather than this being my dimension for my recycler view. Oh no, I'm sorry, this is a string, not a dimension. So I want to create a string resource value for list heading. And I'll just call it, I'll put in the value as our restaurants. So that's going to be the heading on the top of our activity. I also want to create a margin at the top so the recycler view is not pushed right up against our heading. There's a little bit of a gap in between. So I'm going to create a dimension resource value here. And I'll set that value at 80 dp. So just use Alt-Shift-Enter or the code hint above this margin top dimension. You can set it for any value you like. I found 80 seems to work in terms of giving us a reasonable amount of spacing. So now in my demens file, we've got this second dimension called margin top. And set to 80. So we've created the basic layout here for our list. We now need to create a new XML resource file. There's no Kotlin file attached. It's just an XML file that will define the item template for each item in our recycler view. So basically what we're going to use is we're going to add two controls to that template. We're going to use a text view for displaying the restaurant name. And then beside it, we're going to use a rating bar to show the number of stars on a 5-star scale. I could have used it on the input, but I wanted to use the spinner instead just for variety, just so we could look at how we would interact programmatically with the spinner. And then we'll look at using this rating bar control. We're probably not going to get this all finished today with all the working code, but that's okay. We can finish it up next week. So I'm going to go to my layout under Resources Layout. I'm going to right click here and I'm going to create a new layout resources file. So it's not an activity, it's just a layout template. I'll call the file name item_restaurant.xml, but I'm going to change the layout. Instead of using a constraint layout, we're actually going to use a linear layout. I just got to make sure this is the right namespace. It might not be under Android X. So bear with me for a second. We'll just check the docs. I don't think it's in that Android X. Yeah, it's just android.widget.linear layout. So android.widget.linear layout, that's our root element, and our file name is called item_restaurant.xml. So I'll create that layout. So this isn't a full activity, it's just a template for each row. So our width is match parent. We want to change the layout height. This is important. We don't want each row to fill the whole window. We only want each row in our recycler to wrap the content. So I'm going to change that. We're going to set the orientation to horizontal so that our restaurant names and ratings appear beside each other rather than stacked vertically. We also need to kind of set out how much space, how wide each of those should be. And we'll add a little space at the bottom. Actually, you know what? We'll leave it like this for now. We'll just keep it simple. We can play with the formatting later. And now I'm going to add a text view and a rating bar. So I'll put these in the chat, but first we want a text view. Our width will create a new dimension. And our height will just wrap the content. So this shouldn't be any bigger than the text inside, no taller. We're going to align this to the left, so we use the layout gravity. So for each item, the name appears on the left and the rating appears on the right. And we want the weight, we want the name to take up roughly 80% of the row. And lastly, we need to give this an ID. We'll call it name text view. I do need to create this dimension resource. We'll maybe try it at around we'll try it at maybe 250 dp. We may have to adjust it. So I'll create my dimension resource. You could create it manually in the dimensions file. I'll just create it manually for now. And then I want a rating bar. So our width and height will both just wrap the content. Our gravity is right, so align it to the right side. And we have to set out in the rating bar how many stars, what's the scale. So we're going to set it to 5. And we'll just give it an ID of, we can just call it rating bar, I guess. So this is our template. Inside our recycler view, each item will be laid out with a linear layout. So kind of like a grid. It arranges views either in a single row or single column. And then inside each row, we have a text view that displays the restaurant name. Beside it, we have a rating bar that displays the rating on a 5-star scale. We'll probably want to add some more formatting to this, but we can start here. We can always go back and improve the formatting later. So this template, we're going to programmatically bind it inside of our recycler view. So for every document in our Firestore data set, we're going to create a new row in our linear layout. Is how this is going to work. So now we can start to write the code to fetch the data, bind the overall data set to the recycler view, and then we also need to bind it each item at a time so that we can map the name property of our class into our name text view, and that we can map the rating to our 5-star rating bar. So we're going to go into our list activity. And the first thing I'm going to do, and I'm going to declare this, do this at the class level, is we're going to connect to the DB. So we'll call getInstance at the class level. So then we've got access to our database connection everywhere in the class. Inside our onCreate, we need to set our recycler view to use linear layout. So this will tell our recycler view that we have here that the template inside is using linear layout. So we're going to call set layout manager . Okay, we can just do it this way without the setter, actually. Even better. And then we want to query the DB for all restaurants. So we want to order by the name, ascending. So our list is sorted alphabetically A to Z. We'll need to make an import here to Firebase Firestore. Oh, we've got a bunch of options here. So there's 3 different query objects. I'm going to pick this one. It's the Firebase Firestore query class that I need for this reference. Sorry. So that makes the reference here to com.google.firebase.firestore.query. So now we need to set up a couple of inner classes for working with our data. We need an adapter class, a recycler adapter, and we also need a view holder. So these classes I kind of mentioned here. So we now need to add some of these classes so that we can hold the data and then bind it to our recycler view. So outside of my onCreate, we're going to create the inner classes needed to bind the data to the recycler view. So the first one we need is the view holder. So this is basically just an empty constructor. I'll put this in the chat. And again, we've got multiple choices for our reference. So I'm going to import just from actually, I want to import from the Firestore view. Sorry, I did the wrong, sorry, that was the wrong import. Take that reference out. I just want the Android view. The other class we need is our adapter class. So I'm going to create a restaurant adapter, which also has an internal constructor. And we need to set out some options here using the Firestore recycler class. And we're going to bind this our data type for our recycler is going to be restaurant. So using our class. So this is where we're binding our class to our view holder. And we're going to need some imports here as well. So first I'll need to import and then what this will tell me is we need to inherit, because it's not an abstract class, we need to inherit, we need to implement the members. So there's two methods we need to implement. There's the onCreate and there's the onBind. So I think I'll implement those members and then we'll pause here and we'll maybe complete this next week. Because I know the code's getting a bit complicated. I don't want to add too much of it at once. So in this prompt, I'm going to implement the members and I'm going to choose both onCreate and onBind. So what should we do when the view holder gets generated? And what do we do when each document gets bound to our recycler? So I'm going to implement those. And both of them just say they're not implemented yet. That's fine. Whoops, I'm sorry, under the constructors, this should say options should be declared here. So our code should build. It's not complete yet, but I think I would like to pause here for today so that we can also go over it again next week before we complete it. Okay, so I'll just build my app. So what I want to do next week is complete the code inside create and onBind, and that should populate our recycler view. But once we have these classes, we also need to instantiate an instance of our adapter and bind our query result. So we still have a while to go, and we've done a lot of work today. And it's 10 to 2. Sure. So the spinner element in our main activity, it has an entries property that you see here, and it's tied to an array. Inside of strings.xml, I defined this array called ratings. So it's reading these values from the array. So I'm going to push today's code to GitHub. We'll resume with this next week. We'll finish off our recycler view so we can connect up our query using a recycler adapter. We'll use those create and bind methods, and then we're going to have to add some formatting. Once we do that, we're also going to, yep, sure. And then we're going to want to add some floating action buttons for navigation, so users can move back and forth between adding restaurants and the list. Yes, you could create your own separate resource file for an array if you wanted to. Yes, you can do that. Good question. Okay, I will push what we've done up to Git. That's L52. Setup recycler. Okay, so all the code's been pushed up to get. I will upload the videos to YouTube a bit later today. They're going to take a while to process. And we'll resume from here next week. Okay, thanks for your participation. Thanks for joining today. Have a great weekend. I will see all of you next week.